Tonight on Reporting Scotland, calls to speed up the extradition of the Australian former monk accused of sexually abusing children at Fort Augustus Abbey. Cameron House Hotel is to remain closed until further notice, while investigators examine what caused the fire that claimed 2 lives. A director of Aberdeen Football Club has been charged by the SFA with breaking their gambling rules.
Police, what's the address of your emergency?
We'll be live at Police Scotland's control room as they prepare for the busiest time of their year. And a railway worker who died trying to stop an armed robbery in the 70s is honoured for his bravery.
It's turned out to be a beautiful celebration of his life and his spirit and his courage and his bravery. And I am immensely proud of my father.
Good evening. There's concern that an Australian former monk accused of sexually abusing children at a Catholic boarding school in the Highlands may never face trial. Father Dennis Alexander is in custody in Sydney and he's contesting extradition on the grounds of ill health. The 81-year-old was among several monks accused in a BBC Scotland documentary in 2013 of sexual and physical abuse at the Fort Augustus Abbey School. He denies the allegations. From Sydney, Phil Mercer reports.
All right, turn that bloody thing off.
Dennis Alexander has never given a full public account of his time at the Fort Augustus Abbey School in the 1970s, but has denied any wrongdoing. It's almost a year since he was arrested by police in Sydney, and he's been held in custody ever since. A prominent Australian MP says the extradition process is moving far too slowly.
But this has been going on far too long. There are victims who want to have their matters heard in court. And again, it's time that Mr. Alexander and those who are supporting him and those who are protecting him do everything within their power to put him on a plane and ensure that he faces justice back in Scotland.
A royal commission has found that tens of thousands of children were abused in Australian institutions in past decades. Most of the perpetrators were members of the clergy and school teachers. The Royal Commission said that institutions across Australia had covered up the abuse of children on a massive scale and had routinely protected paedophiles. These are clearly turbulent times for the Catholic Church here. It's under the sort of pressure it's never felt before. And we still don't know if the Church is helping to finance Dennis Alexander's fight against extradition to Scotland. John Ellis was abused by another Australian monk implicated in a suspected paedophile ring in the Highlands in the 1970s. He believes that Dennis Alexander will eventually be sent back to Scotland.
I would hope that the authorities over there continue with every effort to work through the labyrinth of the respective legal systems and have him finally brought to justice. And we've had a number of cases where there's been attempts to extradite people, and it's not uncommon for that to go on for 4 or 5 years before they're finally brought to justice.
A spokesperson for Australia's Attorney General says the government won't comment on the ongoing extradition process. But for Dennis Alexander's alleged victims on the other side of the world, the long wait continues. Phil Mercer, BBC News, Sydney.
The BBC's investigations into the allegations surrounding Father Alexander were carried out by Mark Daly, and he joins me now. What's the reaction been here to these latest developments?
There has been reaction, as you would expect, from Father Alexander's accusers. Former Fort Augustus Abbey pupil Hugh Kennedy told me today that he feels powerless, and as a result of the continued delays, feels that there's an ever-increasing doubt that Dennis Alexander will ever come and face me in a courtroom for how he has ruined my life. Now, there's also been a significant intervention from Dr. Andrew McClellan. Now, he led an inquiry into child sexual abuse within the Catholic Church in 2014, and what Dr. McClellan said to me today was that how sad it is that there is no public outcry about the long delays in bringing these offences and offenders to court. Now, this comes on a day that the Crown announced it was dropping 5 further Fort Augustus abuse cases. And with 1 assault conviction secured earlier this year, that leaves just 3 potential Fort Augustus abuse cases outstanding, including the one we've been hearing about.
So what about the Crown Office? What are they saying about the delay in this case?
Well, the situation is now in the hands of the Australian authorities, but questions persist about just how it took so long to get the case to this stage in the first place. It is 4.5 years since Hugh Kennedy first made his complaint to the police, and yet we still don't know whether Father Alexander will ever see the inside of a Scottish courtroom. Now, for the Crown's part, it told me today that the Fort Augustus case had been particularly difficult. It said that the passage of time presented particular challenges, especially around important witnesses who were either dead or not able to take part. Now, I suspect we'll be hearing much more about Fort Augustus because Scotland is having its own child sexual abuse inquiry into institutional child abuse, and I expect Fort Augustus to feature very prominently in that.
Mark Daly, thank you very much for that. It's been announced that Cameron House Hotel by Loch Lomond will remain closed until further notice, while investigators examine the causes of the fire that cost 2 men their lives. There were emotional scenes at Holyrood as the First Minister promised that any lessons learned from the inquiries would result in action if needed. This from our political editor, Brian Taylor.
Closed for inquiries. In a statement, Cameron House management have asked guests and customers to remain patient while they work with the emergency services to establish the extent of the damage and decide when the hotel can reopen. Monday's fire took the lives of a London couple, Richard Dyson and Simon Midgley. The hotel is in Jackie Bailey's Dumbarton constituency. As she arrived in Parliament, she seemed resolute.
Merry Christmas, everybody.
But as she rose to question the First Minister about the tragedy, emotion all but overwhelmed her.
The First Minister will be aware of the tragic fire at Cameron House Hotel earlier this week. I'm sure she'll join with me in sending condolences to the families that lost loved ones and to praise our emergency services, the firefighters, police officers and paramedics who attended, as well as the staff who played a critical role in evacuating the building.
Jackie Bailey, who met the hotel manager yesterday, also urged that lessons should be learned.
First Minister.
The First Minister responded with sympathy, with praise for the emergency services and a promise of action if necessary.
Of course, there will be a thorough investigation into what happened at Cameron House, and it is important that that investigation is allowed to run its course. But I can give an assurance today that the Scottish Government, with our partners and indeed with the owners of Cameron House Hotel, will make sure that any lessons that emerge from that investigation are learned and fully applied.
The session also featured questions on education, the economy, the health service, significant topics, valid topics, but on this day completely overshadowed by emotion, tragedy and lost lives. Brian Taylor, reporting Scotland.
A health board has been criticised over the care of an elderly woman who was sent home alone in a taxi from hospital in the middle of the night and later died. Staff at Monklands Hospital in Airdrie also missed abnormal blood test results for the 78-year-old patient and failed to offer her pain relief. The Scottish Public Services Ombudsman said she was shocked by NHS Lanarkshire's actions in the case. The health board says it fully accepts the recommendations and will address them. A director of Aberdeen Football Club has been charged by the Scottish FA of breaking strict rules on gambling. Duncan Skinner, who's also on the board of Sport Scotland, is said to have placed a total of 589 bets, including one on Aberdeen to lose. Our senior football reporter, Chris McLaughlin, is outside the National Stadium for us now. Chris.
Well, Sally, it's a foggy night here on the south side of Glasgow, but the rules when it comes to football betting are crystal clear. Basically, if you're involved in any way, shape or form with a football club, you just simply cannot bet in any match across the world. Now, Duncan Skinner has been at Aberdeen since 2015. It's the alleged those 589 bets covered a total of over 1,400 matches of those bets involved his own club, and crucially this game against Celtic earlier this year at Celtic Park. The home side won the match 1-0. Duncan Skinner bet on Aberdeen to lose that game. We should point out there's no evidence or suggestion of match fixing here. He has been cooperating with the SFA, and he'll have a hearing here at the National Stadium on the 11th of next month.
And what kind of sanction then is he facing if he's found guilty?
Well, this is not the first time that even a director in Scottish football has been found in breach of gambling rules in football. Earlier this year, the Annan chairman Henry McClelland was found guilty of similar offences and was fined £3,000. Also, football players have fallen foul to these rules. The most high-profile, perhaps, Joey Barton, the former Rangers midfielder. He was banned for 18 months for a breach of football betting rules in England by the English FA. Coming back to this case, we should point out that Aberdeen have released a statement this evening basically saying they are cooperating with the SFA. They're also having their own internal investigation, but because this case is live, they will not be commenting further. Sally.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. The contractor building the new Aberdeen bypass has been issued with a penalty of more than £250,000 for polluting two of Scotland's most important salmon rivers, the Don and the Dee. It's the biggest case of its kind since the Scottish Environment Protection Agency was given new powers. Our environment correspondent, Kevin Keane, has more.
The pollution is obvious. Silt carried by rainwater runs from the construction site straight into waterways. Over a 2-year period, this happened almost 50 times, involving 17 individual burns and rivers. Most worrying was when it hit the River Dee, one of the most important salmon rivers in Scotland.
It's actually the load going down the river.
An investigation was launched by SEPA, whose chief executive tells me the provisions for handling rainwater were inadequate.
We were very disappointed with the performance of the contractor. So 47 incidents over about a 2-year period is not good enough. And it's hard to judge what the actual damage was because you're talking about water courses that cover a long distance, but the potential impact if that stuff keeps going is very serious.
On one occasion, the pollution halted work on the entire length of the bypass. On others, the project was stopped in sections. The biggest fear throughout was for the salmon.
The little spaces between the stones and gravels can get choked up and smothered, and these juvenile fish can't use them. As well as that, it can have a negative impact upon their breathing. It can damage their gills directly through the fine sediments.
The £280,000 penalty has been agreed under powers recently acquired by SEPA. It avoids the need for lengthy prosecutions and means greater benefits for affected areas, in this case several fishing and community groups.
Well, that's a key point. Instead of money going to lawyers and processors, the money has more quickly been paid up by the company, and in addition it goes directly to a series of community groups for direct community benefit.
Transport Scotland, on behalf of the contractors, says it's been working to ensure watercourses are better protected from construction activities. They welcome any measures which result in a positive impact on the environment. This has been a massive construction project, building 36 miles of dual carriageway over the last 3 years. It's scheduled for completion before the end of the winter. Kevin Keane reporting Scotland, Aberdeen.
You're watching BBC Reporting Scotland. It's just coming up to 17 minutes to 7. A reminder of tonight's top story. Calls to speed up the extradition of the Australian former monk accused of sexually abusing children at Fort Augustus Abbey School. And still to come, a festival running in Aberdeen for more than 4 decades could be under threat after councillors vote to cut its funding. Every year, police across Scotland will deal with more than 2 million calls. 500,000 of those are emergencies. December is the busiest month in the calendar. Tonight, our reporter Stephen Godden is at Bilston Glen Call Centre just outside Edinburgh. Stephen.
Yes, Sally, this is the control centre covering the east of the country. You can see people behind me working away. They're dealing with emergency 999 calls and non-emergency 101 calls, and they're dealing with a lot of them. As you said, for the staff here and at the other control centres across Scotland, December is the busiest month in the calendar, and in some ways it's quite easy to become lost in the numbers when it comes to call volumes. But one useful statistic: every minute they will deal with one emergency 999 call, and in that same minute they'll deal with 128 non-emergency calls.
Police, what's the address of your emergency?
The first point of call in an emergency.
Has he been violent or anything, aggressive?
And for these handlers, the calls just keep coming.
You're conscious of time and how fast. Obviously, people don't phone up an emergency and say, "This is where I am. Can you please get the police here?" You know, they're shouting down the phone. It can be hard to try and calm people down and find where they are. So there is pressure there, especially when you're not too familiar always with where they're calling from.
It looks as though he's walking towards the bridge.
Across the room, calls are assessed and prioritised, allowing decisions to be made about how best to respond.
Go ahead to 15 Bravo.
Can we have your attendance, please? It's a K5 sitting there. We're trying to get the ambulance to go to it.
That's acknowledged. We're en route there now.
For the officers taking their instruction from Bilston Glen, from Fife to the borders, winter only adds to the workload.
Obviously with the icy conditions as well, our infrastructure and the road networks especially, a lot of issues come from that. Also this time of year there's a number of office parties happening. It's a time of year for folk getting together and having a drink or two, and that obviously leads on to issues for the policing in town centre and nighttime economy as well. Since the formation of Police Scotland, it's a system that's changed considerably. Resources concentrated in fewer control centres, and recent history shows that when the system doesn't work, there are serious consequences. In July 2015, a call to Bilston Glen about a crash on the M9 wasn't initially followed up. 3 days later, Lamara Bell was found seriously injured in the car beside her dead partner, John Yule. She died later in hospital. The review, ordered in the aftermath, found that call handlers at Bilston Glen faced unacceptably high levels of pressure. And could you just confirm the full address for me there, please?
Today, senior officers insist that has changed. Improvements, including robust IT systems and clear procedures for dealing with calls.
The biggest telling factor for me in Bilston Glen is the change in the mood here. There is a real positive culture of learning where staff are encouraged to put forward points for improvement.
That was one of 30 recommendations to emerge from the call handling review. 3 are still to be fully implemented, something ministers say will happen in the coming months.
Where are you?
During which time, the phones across Scotland will ring thousands, perhaps millions of times.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Well, across Scotland, changes to call handling continues. The focus of much of that is in the north. The control centre in Aberdeen closed earlier this year. The control centre in Inverness is due to close next year. Now, those in charge of call handling say that they believe they now have an improved system which is better placed to cope with whatever it is that might be round the corner. That is undoubtedly something that will be scrutinised in the coming months and weeks, but what is certain is that they've got a busy weekend ahead.
Stephen Gordon, thank you very much. It's the time of year when people are hoping to spend time with family and friends, but that's not a reality for a growing number of older people. Charities are warning that this epidemic of loneliness, as it's been called, can affect people's physical as well as mental health. Aileen Clark reports.
Lunch Out with Audrey Matongi. She runs a social enterprise company in Glasgow, which organises volunteers to befriend older people and basically have a chat.
But that's where we went last week, wasn't it?
One lady that I've worked with for over a year, as soon as I came in, she would say, "Put the kettle on, Audrey, and we will have a cup of friendship." Such a darling. And what this basically meant was this is how she would go through what's happened over the week, and she'd talk to me about her experiences. Now we can decide what we're going to eat.
A widower for 15 years now, Sid says living on your own as you get on in years can be tough.
Coming to my age, most of them have gone. And that's one of the stumbling blocks that comes, when you start getting on a bit. All your friends you used to visit and, they're not there anymore.
Charities are warning that loneliness can badly affect the health of older people, and it's not just through depression.
No one should feel ashamed about feeling lonely.
The evidence is clear that loneliness is as harmful to health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And we know that there is a link between loneliness and, for example, cardiovascular problems. It can result in older people not looking after themselves properly. They have lower levels of self-worth and self-esteem.
There's also a belief that more social media and less socialising means even less face-to-face contact with our older generation.
It's a lot easier nowadays to just send a message instead of going out your way to visit them in person and actually have face-to-face conversations.
But you still see your gran a lot though?
Yeah, I do, personally.
Some communication is better than no communication. I would certainly agree with that, but I think certainly the personal touch is very important.
Audrey Mutongi is putting on a Boxing Day meal in Glasgow for anyone in need of company. There's a call for community befriending to form part of the Scottish Government's plan to tackle loneliness, which is expected in the new year. Aileen Clark, reporting Scotland, Glasgow.
A festival that's been running in Aberdeen for more than 4 decades could be under threat after city councillors voted to cut its funding. The Aberdeen International Youth Festival has played host to more than 30,000 young people since it began in 1973. Rebecca Curran reports.
1,100 performers from the 4 corners of the world have arrived in the city, which...
1977, and Aberdeen's Union Street was packed with performers from all over the world. The International Youth Festival has been running for more than 40 years, but it could be under threat after city councillors decided to cut its funding. Councillors took just 5 minutes to make their decision to withdraw funding from the International Youth Festival. They voted instead to set up a fund that will issue grants to cultural groups in 2018. In the past, the council has funded the festival to the tune of around £120,000, a quarter of the total budget.
We felt there was not enough value from the business case to award that funding. And it's now up to the Youth Festival to have a revised business case, and that will come back to us for grant funding.
Over the years, the event has played host to around 30,000 young people.
It's not immediately at risk because we have money through till the spring, so it gives us a bit of time to reflect. It's going to make it far more challenging because you've got to go looking for the resources elsewhere or reshape what you do significantly.
On the streets of Aberdeen, a sense of disappointment.
To hear that's being cut is really quite tragic. And to have been living in Aberdeen for 2.5 years, it is a little bit sad to hear something like that being, taken away.
I guess I can understand why they have to control their budgets and their spend, but this is something that's really important.
Music brings people together, all these activities, and it's probably a good opportunity for Aberdeen to get its name out there.
As the city begins to wind down for the Christmas holiday, organisers say they'll be working flat out to find funding elsewhere. Rebecca Curran, reporting Scotland, Aberdeen.
A memorial has been unveiled in Glasgow for a railway worker who was shot dead as he tried to stop a gang of armed robbers. James Kennedy was killed on this day in December 1973 at the St Rollox Railworks in Springburn. Laura Maxwell has more.
44 years since his death, James Kennedy was remembered. The heroism of the railwayman who gave his life for his work. A bittersweet day for his daughters, who grew up without him.
This is a chance for us to remember Dad's bravery, but also to celebrate his bravery and what he did, and to inspire other people.
The thieves struck at just after 7 o'clock in the morning. Their target, the last payroll before Christmas.
It's become one of the biggest manhunts Glasgow has ever known.
It was a particularly brutal robbery. Several workers were injured, but despite knowing they were armed, James Kennedy stepped into their way.
The shootout started just there. They immediately started shooting. They blew a hole in the doors, 2 holes in the doors. They wounded 3 other guards. He tried to close the gate, and a fight broke out there between him and them. They beat him up, and then he followed them out onto the road, and they shot him dead out in the road. And he was incredibly brave. And as I said, they were just cowards.
The gang got away with just under £10,000, but were eventually caught and jailed. James Kennedy was awarded the George Cross, his wife and daughters accepting the honour from the Queen. Over the years there have been memorials, but not here, where it happened.
We only commemorate the railway workers who are the very bravest. We realised that there was no memorial to James Kennedy. The locomotive that was named after him had been withdrawn. The street that was named after him had been demolished. So it seemed sensible to do a special plaque for James.
This is a date that I always dread because I remember so well the day that he died, and it stirs up tremendous emotion in me every year. But it's turned out to be a beautiful celebration of his life and his spirit and his courage and his bravery, and I am immensely proud of my father.
James Kennedy, an ordinary man who demonstrated extraordinary bravery. Laura Maxwell, reporting Scotland, Glasgow.
The last timeline of the year is over on BBC Two at 7:30 tonight. Glenn and Shireen can tell us what's coming up.
Tonight, a look at loneliness at Christmas and what we can all do to help.
Cooking tips for the big day with Master Chef Gary McLean.
We meet the 10-year-old boy with a new bionic hand.
And the Scottish actor now playing R2-D2 in Star Wars. That's Timeline, 7:30 BBC Two.
In the meantime, let's see what we can expect from the weather. Here's Chris.
Sally, thank you. Hello there, good evening to you. Well, it's been fairly cloudy, quite misty and murky for some of us today, and little change through the course of this evening and overnight. That low cloud and fog across many central and southern parts of the country persisting, as indeed it will around the west coast as well. Unfortunately, my graphics have stopped working, so you'll just have to listen to me. There's nothing for you to see. So, tonight, quite a murky night in store, quite cloudy, but there will be some clear skies across parts of the northeast through Aberdeenshire, with temperatures here in the countryside down to freezing. But certainly where we have the cloud and the murk, not quite that chilly, around 5 to 8 Celsius. Tomorrow, Friday, well, it's a miserable day. It's quite cloudy, it's quite dull and sort of dank, really. Misty, murky once again. There will be some sunshine on offer. That's most likely across parts of the northeast. So Aberdeenshire, parts of East Angus, East Fife, East Lothian, the eastern borders. Some brightness for you, but elsewhere, brightness in short supply. It will be fairly misty and murky. Some drizzle at times around the west coast and across Western Hills, the Northern Isles too. And temperatures tomorrow around 8 to 10 Celsius. Then, looking ahead to the run-up to Christmas, well, it all goes downhill, really. It turns quite wet. Saturday, most of the rain in the northwest across parts of the Highlands and Islands, and edging its way southwards in towards parts of the Central Belt by the end of the day. Best of the sunshine again across the northeast. Aberdeenshire could well be into the teens, 14 Celsius potentially at times. So a mild day, but for most of us, pretty cloudy and at times quite wet. And talking of rain, well, certainly on Sunday, Christmas Eve, it will be wet through the Central Highlands. There is a Met Office be aware warning in force for that. Difficult conditions on the road, some localised flooding potentially at times. And the big day itself, Christmas Day, well, that will be wet, but wet with rain. Perhaps a little bit of snow over the hills and high ground, but only in the north. That's the forecast.
Who needs a map? Respect, Chris. That was brilliant. I will be back with the headlines at 8 and the late bulletin just after at the 10 o'clock news. Until then, do have a good evening. Bye-bye.